everyone has a safe and enjoyable 4th of July holiday. This coming Monday, June 30th, members are invited to attend an open meeting of the Energy and Environment Standing Committee. Bowen Blair, Executive Secretary of the Friends of the Columbia Gorge, will give a progress report on Columbia Gorge National Scenic Area legislation. This brown bag lunch will be from 12:30 to 1:30 at 850 Southwest Broadway, Suite 1100. If you forget that, call the office and they'll tell you. An exciting second Wednesday program is coming up on Wednesday, July 9th, entitled Visions of Oregon in the 21st Century, High Technology and International Trade. The program will explore some of the possibilities for Oregon in the next century. Panelists are Jim Gardner, partner in the law firm of Lindsay, Hart, Neal, and Weigler, former state senator, and a primary author of legislation promoting research and development activities. And Dr. James Manning, director of the International Trade and Commerce Institute at Portland State University, and Dr. John Owen, vice chancellor of the Oregon Center for Advanced Technology Education. The panelists anticipate that Oregon will strengthen the lead it now has in the design and manufacture of supercomputers and gallium arsenide chips through an educational and technical infrastructure supported by government, business, and higher education. The panelists also believe that growth in Oregon's foreign trade can aid our resource-based economy, and they will discuss how government and educational institutions can facilitate that growth. That program will be at the Portland Center Red Lion on Southwest 3rd and Lincoln from 5:30 to 7 p.m. Doors will be open at 5 p.m. The public is invited. There's a $3.50 admission charge, which includes light food. 2 weeks from today, on Friday, July 11th, our featured speaker will be Marilyn Eichinger, Executive Director of the Oregon Museum of Science and Industry. Since coming to OMSI last fall, she has exhibited a bold new leadership at the museum. She will discuss the changing role of science centers and their importance to science and education as we approach the 21st century. That program will be here in the Mayfair Room at noon on Friday, July 11th. And we would like to give you another friendly reminder to send in your membership dues for the 1986-87 membership year, which has now begun. It helps the club office if reminder notices do not have to be sent. We value your membership and hope that you will join the City Club for another year. And if you know someone who would enjoy being a City Club member, call the club office and membership materials will be sent. Our board host this noon, who will have the privilege of asking the first question to the speaker, is Jake Tanzer, a member of the Board of Governors. Jake. Our program today was made possible by the cooperation of the Labor Studies Institute of Portland State University. This summer, Portland State is offering an interdisciplinary symposium on the history, problems, and future of the labor movement in America. And its keynote speaker was Mr. Douglas Fraser, former president of the United Auto Workers, and who is our speaker today. Mr. Fraser is a native of Scotland. He came to this country with his parents when he was a small boy, and he grew up in Detroit, where he worked in the automobile industry since the age of 18. He became active in the United Auto Workers, rose through various offices to become local president, then became administrative assistant to then President Walter Reuther, with whom he was involved in many major negotiations. From 1962 to 1970, he served on the International Executive Board of the UAW. He was an international vice president from 1970 to 77, and he was international president from 1977 until his retirement in 1983. From 1980 to 84, he served on the board of directors of the Chrysler Corporation, and he was perhaps the first union representative to sit on the board of a major corporation. He is now a professor of labor studies at Wayne State University, and he also lectures at Harvard and other schools, including Portland State. Recent years have seen many changes in the labor movement. Among them have been the marked decline in union membership, the union givebacks in contract negotiations as a result of depressed industrial conditions, and a trend toward union representation on company boards of directors. Mr. Fraser is particularly well qualified to comment on these and other aspects of the labor movement, and we are eager to hear his views on organized labor in the next decade. Mr. Fraser met with our City Club Committee on Labor and Industries this morning and then rushed over to teach a class at Portland State, so we're keeping him pretty busy while he's here in Portland. Mr. Fraser.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure for me to address the City Club of Portland. When I came to Portland, I wondered if I would be asked a question which is asked of me any place I go in the country, that question being, is Lee Iacocca interested in getting into the politics of our nation? There's great curiosity about this man. And then that's followed with a question, does Lee Iacocca want to be President of the United States? And I can tell you, Lee Iacocca does not want to be President of the United States. He wants to be king. He was giving a speech in Washington about 3 weeks ago, the National Conference of Newspaper Editors, and he's putting him on a bit, and he says he indeed is going to run for president. And his vice presidential candidate on his ticket is going to be Dr. Ruth. And after they're elected, he's going to tell the people what to do, and Dr. Ruth is going to tell you how to do it. Well, as we visit this afternoon, we really are in troubled times, not only for the labor movement, but I believe the country. But the labor movement is going through probably the worst period since its formative years, at least in terms of the industrial unions. You see, as was mentioned, unions making economic concessions in a variety of industries. Some of them, I believe, are economically justified. Other demands for concessions are made upon unions because the employer is trying to take advantage of a bad situation. And from a union point of view, it seems to me they should resist concessions that are not based upon sound economic facts, or if you're just delaying the inevitable of a company going bankrupt. But there are some interesting things happening. And probably the most interesting is to look at the steel industry and what's happening in those negotiations. Now, historically, the steel industry has always bargained as a single group, but this year they're bargaining company by company. And so far, the Steelworkers Union has made agreements in Wheeling, Pittsburgh, LTV, and National, Bethlehem, and in the last couple of days, Inland Steel. All of the agreements fashioned to meet the facts of that particular bargaining table. And while the steelworkers are making economic concessions, the agreements also provide that the workers will recover those concessions should the companies prosper. And they're also getting representation on the board of directors, and there are other quid pro quos. In auto, when we made the concessions in 1982, we bargained, and the company agreed to put in 5 cents an hour for training. In the subsequent negotiations, that was increased to 15 cents an hour. And what this means in General Motors, for example, it generates $110 million a year, in Ford about $40 million, and in Chrysler about $30 million. This is a very meaningful way to train a workforce for the future, to train a workforce for different industries, for those that will not be recalled to the auto industry. We also negotiated guarantees against layoffs, guarantees against plant closings. But each collective bargaining situation is different. It should be based upon the economic facts. And in the final analysis, the people that work in that plant, and this is as it should be, have to make the decision as to whether or not, in their mind, those concessions are justified. I suppose ideally, and I don't know if we'll ever reach the day where negotiations are based upon the power of persuasion rather than the persuasion of power. But the labor movement is rapidly coming to the conclusion that the solutions to the problems of their constituents cannot be found at the bargaining table. Oh, sure, you can, as we did in auto and another industry, negotiate quality of work-life programs, which I think are meaningful, because essentially what a quality of work-life program means is that the worker has input in the way his work is organized, that they're part of the decision-making process, that it democratizes the workplace, and all of these things I think are to the good and are going to continue in the future. When you get all done with it, so many things are dependent upon external events. Since 1981, we have lost in the United States 2,300,000 manufacturing jobs. That isn't attributable to anything that happened in the bargaining table. It's attributable to an overvalued dollar, which is a consequence of high interest rates, which is a consequence of the deficit. You can only find a solution to that in the political arena. The auto workers, in addition to organizing the auto industry, also have organized the agricultural implement industry. And because of the overvalued dollar, the great exporting companies like John Deere and Caterpillar do not export in the fashion that they did. And because the farmers are not exporting because of the overvalued dollar up to the level that they used to, they can't buy the farm machinery. And as a consequence of all that, the employment in the farm industry, farm implement industry, that's John Deere, Caterpillar, Harvest, J.I. Case, Ellis Chalmers, and the rest of them, it's only 40% of what it used to be as late as 1979. I looked at the figures the other day about the horrendous trade deficit, $150 billion, $90 billion in manufacturing goods, and as late as 1981, we had a surplus in manufactured goods of $12 billion. Here again, the solution is not at the bargaining table, but it rests in the trade policy, and we have no trade policy. And that really galls me when I think about the desperate needs of our nation, that at the end of this fiscal year we'll find that we've probably paid $138 billion in interest on our national debt, that will not build one highway or bridge, will not build one schoolhouse or increase one teacher's salary. And so the labor movement has to be involved in the political life of our nation. But they can't be involved in the political life of our nation only to be concerned about the problems confronting the labor movement. The labor movement is not a monolith, but the overwhelming majority of the leadership of the labor movement are concerned about what happens in the community as well as what happens to their members. We used to have a slogan in UAW. It originated with Walter Reuther, and he used to say, we have to make progress with the community. We can't make progress at the expense of the community. So the labor movement has to be a force for social good. Mention and it's made and much is written about the fact that the labor movement now has only 18% of the workforce organized, an abysmal figure. Now, that results not from people turning their backs on unions, people who are union members. It's because of the contraction of employment in industries where we're real highly organized, steel and auto and rubber. And the problem, I think, is manyfold. First of all, let me admit that the labor movement has problems with their image, and some of that is justified, and some of it is unjustified. It's very difficult to organize in the United States, more difficult than any place in the free world. And I say this without fear of successful contradiction, that as a group, there's many, many exceptions, thank goodness, we have the most anti-union employers in the whole free world. Only in America do you find labor relations consultants those firms whose exclusive mission is to try to prevent unions from organizing and destroy unions after unions have existed even for a number of years. Only in America do workers get discharged for exercising their right under the law to organize themselves and their fellow workers. And Paul Weiler, the Harvard Law School, did a study 2 years ago, and he found that in 1970, 2,723 American workers were discharged for exercising their right under the law, who subsequently were reinstated with full back pay, either by the National Labor Relations Board or the federal courts. In 1980, with the same number of elections, over 10,000 were discharged. Now, what has happened, the employers have found that this is a good investment. They discharge the worker. He's taken away from the workplace during the campaign, whether or not the workers want to join a union, and then it takes sometimes years to get a hearing before the federal court for reinstatement, and then when they're reinstated, 80% of those reinstated workers, those 10,000, elect not to go back to their old place of employment because they don't want to go back to a hostile atmosphere where they don't have any union. And secondly, under the law, when a worker is reinstated with full back pay, you deduct that amount of money he's earned in the interim. So the penalty on the employer who discharged their worker is really not sufficient. If you look around the world, you're not talking about 18% of the people being organized in the workforce. In Great Britain and Germany, you're talking about 45, 50%. In the Scandinavian countries, 80%. But you say, well, they have a different tradition, a different history. So let's look at Canada. It's interesting looking in Canada because coincidentally in 1955, both in Canada and the United States, 35% of the workforce was organized. In 1965, it has slipped to 29% in each country. Now we have our 18%, and Canada has 40%. Now what's the difference? You have basically the same geographic and economic environment. The companies are the same in many cases. The unions are the same in many cases. The organizers, Canadian organizers and American organizers, are trained in the same room, the same techniques. And the difference is in the law and the attitude of the companies. It is socially unacceptable in Canada or any other democracy in the world to savage a union the way unions are savaged in the United States by some American employers. But here again, the solution to that problem can only be found in a political arena. And I don't want to dwell upon only the problems of the labor movement. There are plenty of other problems in our society that the labor movement has to be concerned with. And the labor movement just can't be a vehicle in which you negotiate increased wages and fringe benefits. It has to be a movement for social change. And we're interested in the betterment of all citizens of our nation. Labor is accused many times of being greedy. A lot of editorial writers, when they're reading about this, they say, well, even Sam Gompers at the latter part of the last century and the beginning of this century was asked, what does labor want? And Gompers was to reply, more. Well, it's part of the answer that Gompers gave. Gompers was asked, what does labor want? And he says, more. We want more schoolhouses and less jails, more books and less vice, more constant work and less crime, more leisure and less greed, more justice and less revenge, which isn't a bad philosophy. But the labor movement for a long time has been in the vanguard of free public education when it came to this country, and we're supportive down through the years in excellence in education, in the search for excellence. But this nation really doesn't put its resources where their mouth is. I happen to believe our educational system is starved. Then when I look at what's happening to the teacher profession, I read that students who are entering schools of education, some of them have no standard aptitude tests, and where they do, their average score is 844 out of 1,600. 49 points below the national SAT score, the average SAT score. So we're not getting the best and the brightest any longer. We're not even getting the average. And you wonder how we can reverse this when in the city of New York, for example, a teacher's starting salary with all of the hazards involved is $14,500. And so this nation has to commit itself to excellence in education, and if you really mean it, you have to give to this country more resources. And that brings me to a topic that I just read about this morning and I wasn't going to discuss, but I sort of get sad when I read that the Congress of the United States yesterday enacted a defense budget of $292,150,000,000. And the president says, well, the budget is all right with him, except he thinks he's shortchanged on defense. And just let me make it plain, I'm not for unilateral disarmament. I happen to believe that we live in a dangerous and treacherous world. I believe that this nation has to be strong. This nation has to be able to defend itself. This nation has to be sufficiently armed so that no nation dare engage in a first strike against us, because the consequences and the retaliation will be so great there'll be an unacceptable risk. Except I thought we were there several years ago. And what is happening, experts in this field are saying that even when you consider the fact that we go from a $150 billion budget in 1980, and 6 years later we've almost doubled it, and we haven't materially improved the defense of our nation, you think about the horrible waste and the other needs that our country has. And this is not me speaking. David Stockman, in his book, you ought to read it, he talks about the horrendous waste in the defense establishment. Dave Packard is head of a commission, and he's pointing out the horrible waste in the procurement policies. But in addition to that, there's a philosophical question of, isn't it time that we should be moving toward an arms agreement that's verifiable, that we can depend upon? President Reagan, when he quotes the presidents of the United States, never quotes a Republican president. You don't blame him for not quoting Nixon, but you think he'd give acknowledgement to the fact that Eisenhower was once president or Ford was once president. He always quotes Roosevelt, Truman, and Kennedy to make his point. So just to show that I can learn even from President Reagan, and it's probably the only thing I'll learn from him, but I want to refer to a quotation from Dwight Eisenhower. And Eisenhower was being criticized in 1956 for not committing enough money for the Defense Department. And he wrote on April of 1956 to an editor, I think it was of Business Week magazine, a fellow by the name of Richard Simon. And this letter never was in the public domain until about 3 years ago, where John Eisenhower released it. And so Eisenhower was addressing this problem of armaments. And he said in 1956 in April, the problem is not merely man against man or nation against nation. It is man against war. I have spent my life in the study of military strength as a deterrent to war, and have studied the character of military armaments necessary to win a war. But we are rapidly getting to the point that no war can be won. War implies a contest. You will get to the point that contest is no longer involved, and the outbreak comes close to destruction of the enemy and suicide for ourselves. And when we get to that point, as someday we will, both sides will know that in any outbreak of general hostilities, regardless of the element of surprise, destruction will be both reciprocal and complete. Possibly then, we will have sense enough to meet at the conference table with the understanding that the era of armaments has ended, and the human race must conform its action to this truth or die. Eisenhower said that 30 years ago, and I believe that it's time to listen to President Eisenhower. One other point that I wish to raise with you. A lot of people are predicting the demise of the labor movement, and don't hold your breath. It's not going to happen. The labor movement has great resiliency. And don't forget, all movements, political movements, social movements, labor movements, have their ups and downs and peaks and valleys, good times and bad times, and we're going through a bad time. And for those who are engaged in the wishful thinking that the American labor movement is going to disappear from the scene, I suggest to them that they should look around the world, and in every single democracy in the world, you'll see a viable labor movement. And look around the world again, look at the Soviet Union and all satellites and the military dictatorships of the right, and you will not find a viable labor movement. All movements, I think, run into some difficulties. I must say for the AFL-CIO, and this is why I'm optimistic, they've realized what a lot of institutions refuse to realize, that they shouldn't rest on the solutions and approaches of the past. They have to look at the future. And I know it's always difficult to change institutions, whether it be the government, whether it be a business, whether it be educational institution, or the labor movement. And I'll be the first to say that the labor movement in the United States, for most part, has been rigid and inflexible. But in the last couple of years, the AFL-CIO organized a committee called the Evolution of Work, and they took a hard look at themselves. They consulted with a lot of the academics of the universities around the country. They engaged the services of pollster Peter Hart to determine the mood of the workers, not only union but non-union. And the interesting thing about this document is it does engage in self-criticism. It does say the approach of the past is no longer good enough. There's a new workforce out there with new attitudes. We've got to find a better way of communicating not only with the workers but the entire nation. And the whole report is filled with experimentation and trying new approaches. And it's to their credit that they engaged in the self-analysis. It's Machiavelli, who was on his deathbed, and a friend to him came to him and he says, Machiavelli, you have only a couple of hours to live, and now is a moment to renounce Satan and all of his teachings. And Machiavelli said, this is no time to make new enemies. Well, I believe that the labor movement wasn't in as sad shape as Machiavelli and they learned before they reached the deathbed. There's another piece of advice, and it comes from John Kennedy. And Theodore White writes that shortly after the Civil Rights Bill was enacted in the summer of 1963, John Kennedy turned to a friend and he says, sometimes you look back at what you have done and the only thing you ask yourself is what took you so long to do it. And I think that's sound advice. It's sound advice to the labor movement, and I think they've heeded that advice. I keep telling the leaders in UAW when I was president that the test of leadership is having the capacity and ability and the courage, as it sometimes takes, to change with times and events. If you don't do that, history's going to pass you by. But I think that the labor movement will change and will be flexible enough to change with times and events, and we're going to survive. And the country can do the same thing, including the Congress and the executive branch. If they can come to grips with problems in a timely fashion and not wait for a crisis, if they change with times and events, then I take a brighter view of the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Fraser. Your comments have been both thoughtful and stimulating. And now we have the opportunity to engage in discussion with Mr. Fraser. And the first question will be asked by our board host, Jake Tanzer. Following that, we'll have questions from the floor. There's a microphone being set up in the center of the floor, and I'll ask that you use the microphone so that the radio audience can hear your questions. And please identify yourself as a member of the City Club. First, Jake.
Thank you, Mr. Fraser. Thank you for your thoughtful comments. I've read Robert Reich and other economists criticize the General Motors Toyota project, the Saturn project, and perhaps the Ford Mazda project to come, as being ultimately very bad for America and for American labor, because it represents a shift to outside of America of the more skilled jobs, the engineering jobs, the design jobs, the management jobs, the fabrication jobs, and relegating American workers to the lower skilled, lower paid assembly jobs. We see a similar process here, where a lot of our fabrication jobs have now moved overseas. Our skilled work and well-paid jobs in the lumber mills and such have moved on, and instead we're building a workforce locally of semiconductor computer assembly people, which is lower skilled, lower paid. Do you see this process is continuing? What are the implications for labor? What are the implications for the American economy?
Before we ate lunch, we were having a nice, friendly conversation. Found out both of us supported Bob Kennedy in 1968 and Jack Kennedy in 1960. Then you asked me this question. One of the tricks of a debater is you always say, even when it's an uncomfortable question, I'm glad you asked that question. I want you to know I hate you for asking that question. Let me start with Bob Reich, and I think he's wrong. One of the last debates I had on the Chrysler board was on a Toyota GM joint venture, and it came about because the general counsel of Chrysler was at Iacocca's behest suing in order to block that joint venture. I argued that that joint venture was good for the American economy because it brings much needed capital in this country and it creates jobs. And so it is, I believe, with the Mazda operation, because what I think we have to realize is the alternative to Mazda and Nissan and Honda and Mitsubishi, we're going to locate in Illinois, and Toyota's going to build another plant in near Lexington, Kentucky, Georgetown, Kentucky. Honda's in Marysville. Nissan is in Smyrna, Tennessee. I think that these are jobs you would never have had, because the alternative to that is building them all in Japan. So I've been preaching for years that the Japanese, with whom we have a one-sided, lopsided, discriminatory trade relationship, it's about time they put some capital where their market is and create some jobs where their sales are. So I have no argument with that, and I disagree with Bob Reich on that. And I think that in addition to that, of course, we now have the Japanese in our territory, and we'll be competing on the same playing field. Now, the other question you raise is extremely troublesome, and I raised with those people who sort of slough it off, and they said, well, after all, in our economy, and we've done a remarkable job, both during the Carter years and the Reagan years, of creating new jobs, maybe 12 million jobs, and look at Germany, and have been absolutely static over the last 10 years. But what kind of jobs? So people say, well, what's the difference? The industrial sector will diminish, if not disappear, and we'll be substituting service jobs. And then I raise the question, who the hell is going to buy the services? The American cannot afford to lose the great blue-collar middle class and white-collar middle class, because they stimulate the economy, they have high-velocity purchasing power, and it'll be a sad day if that should occur. And I come back to the proposition that we need a trade policy. I'll even settle for a mediocre trade policy, as long as we'd have a trade policy. We don't have any. And then it seems to me we should look at Japan. We always look at Japan and see all of the benefits of labor management relationship and their efficiency in production. And why don't we look at the way that the Japanese intervene in a timely, cautious way in terms of industrial policy? Why don't we copy that from them? We don't have such a thing in the United States. So we've got to pay more attention. It's extremely troublesome to me that we're moving in this direction. One other thing. The Labor Department made a study of the years between 81 and 84, and they looked at over 2 million people who became unemployed in the manufacturing sector. 60% of them found other jobs. But in these other jobs that they found, 40% of that 60% took a wage reduction of 25% or more. Now, obviously, the whole standard of living has been shattered, and I'm afraid unless we do something, we're traveling down that road, and we've got to have a more forceful intervention and understanding on the part of our government.
I think I'm going to ask you, Mr. Fraser, you might as well stay up here and field these questions yourself instead of filtering them through me, and it'll save a little time. First question from the floor.
Beverly Stein, member of the City Club. Pleased to see you here, Mr. Fraser. Employee stock ownership plans have traditionally been used as a way of getting concessions from workers and labor unions, but recently I know of several situations where unions have actively participated in structuring those plans, and I wonder what role you see for employee ownership and employee stock ownership plans in revitalizing the union movement.
Well, I think the trend toward ESOPs is going to continue. The difficulty for the labor movement, they get offered ESOPs only by companies who are in deep trouble. You never get offered an ESOP by a company that's prosperous. But even then, there's some great successes. And probably the outstanding success is Weirton Steel in West Virginia. That's an ESOP. It was part of National Steel. And if I can remember the figures, last year they earned $160 million, and they had a profit-sharing payout of $2,400 a workers. But there has been failures. My advice to unions who are invited to participate in the ESOP is don't leap too quickly. They should hire consultants who are knowledgeable in this field, see if that company can survive and is viable. And then, that being the case, I would encourage the workers to participate in ESOPs.
Thank you.
I'm Herb Crane, a member. Before I ask my question, I would like to tell you that in the 30s and 40s I was considered a flaming pink liberal. And I don't think my position has changed in my mind since that time. Now then, you indicated earlier in your remarks that the decline in the labor movement coincided with the decline in the industries, heavy industries of automotive, steel, and rubber, and indicated again that that was coincidental with the fact that these were the most highly organized of American labor unions. I would like to turn that statement back to you in the form of a question. Is it not conceivable, from my viewpoint, is it not even practical, that that wasn't a coincidence, that the fact that these industries were the most highly organized and most successful in achieving their demands, that these industries suffered the decline they did?
Well, I suppose you could point to an industry or a company where that factor might come into play, but let me talk about the economics of the industry that I know best, and that's the auto industry. And in that industry, we're always highly productive. The increase in productivity was far beyond the national average, where the companies were always prosperous, and that enabled us to negotiate high wages and rich fringe benefits. We were no miracle negotiators. That's what the economic facts were. And we never resisted the introduction of new technology and automation, because we knew the fundamental fact of life that if you want to get a larger slice of the economic pie, you bake a bigger pie. And in 1957, just to throw out one set of figures, we produced in this nation, the American workers, 7.5 million cars and trucks. 20 years later, we're producing 12.5 million, about a 74% increase with about a 13% increase in employment. And that's how we got to where we were. But what happened? We are now getting competition from abroad where, admittedly, they get lower labor rates. But you see, let me turn the question that you raised. I think we're now in a position in America where we can compete with the Japanese as our principal competitor. We're not turning out the, I'll say, sloppy cars that we did in 77, 78. The quality has increased substantially. The Japanese are now paying 88% of the American wage. The yen is appreciated by 30%. So I think we can compete. So then here comes Hyundai from Korea. They pay $2.50 an hour, work 54 hours a week, and they have an extremely well-disciplined workforce that not comes from a cultural factor like in Japan, but because they're forced to obey. You have an authoritarian government, authoritarian company. The union has a right to organize but no right to strike. They work in unsafe working conditions. How the hell do you compete against that? And I say you can't. And so if the price of hanging on to those jobs for the auto workers is to conform to the Korean standards, they can forget the auto industry and take it away because the auto workers don't want them. And that's what the situation is like. And I don't think we did ourselves in. If you notice the steel industry now and the Auto Workers Union in 1982, we made the economic concessions that were necessary for those companies to survive. Hell, Lee Iacocca didn't save the Chrysler Corporation. That's a myth. The Chrysler workers saved the Chrysler Corporation, and the bankers and the dealers and the suppliers. That's who saved it. Everybody working together. And we faced that economic reality and saved the company. So I think the union is very conscious of its history, very conscious of the economies in the various industries. But I don't know how we maintain the jobs that we have when the auto industry and the steel industry and the forestry industry are subjected to unfair trade practices and all of the other handicaps that we have to assume. You're right. The decline in the numbers of the labor movement preceded the decline in the industry, but I submit and I repeat, the principal reason for the decline in numbers is a contraction of employment in the highly organized industries.
Marilyn Smith, City Club member. Mr. Fraser, I hear criticism of the defense budget, and I agree it's shocking. How does labor unions reconcile their role to protect jobs with criticism of the defense budget, which indeed produces a number of jobs related to the hardware production in defense?
Well, no question about it. Defense industry produces jobs. But let me point out a negative to the defense industry. If you look at the money that's put in research and development, the percentage of gross national product, you look at those figures, and America's right up there. But you carve out the defense industry, and we're way below Japan in terms of our investment in research and development. Now, you could say there's some spin-off from the defense and research and development, spins off to some consumer goods, but not nearly equate to if you're putting all that money in research and development. In addition to that, we are utilizing in the defense industry and research and development some of the finest minds and talents in the United States that should be engaged in research and development on how to build maybe a better car or how to build a better anything. So I do believe, and I don't really see the relevancy. Obviously, the defense industry provides jobs. Also, I'm suggesting if you could carve out about $150 billion and put it to work trying to satisfy and fulfilling this nation's desperate needs, it would be money that would be much better spent for the health of this nation and the health of the whole world.
Mr. Fraser, I'm Don Sterling, a member. What new things did you learn from your experience on the Chrysler board?
Nothing. No, I'm kidding. Let me say quickly, I think it's necessary to take a couple of minutes to go over the background. Iacocca nominated me to the board in October 1979 in the course of collective bargaining negotiations, but I wasn't elected to the board until a stockholders meeting in May, so this big hiatus. And the first commentary by Wall Street Journal, New York Times, and the rest was, well, this is a revolutionary development. Then he took a second look a couple of months later, and they said, well, maybe this isn't so revolutionary after all, because I'll have the same fiduciary responsibility as any other member of the board, and my principal obligation or exclusive obligation will be to the stockholders. And that disturbed me, so I met with Chrysler, and they agreed, and I don't know if it was done before or since. They allowed me to make a statement, and a proxy statement went out to all of the stockholders of record in March of 1980. And in that statement, I said, I come to the Chrysler board as the president of the UAW. In that capacity, I represent all of the blue-collar workers, and in Chrysler, thousands of white-collar workers. And I come there as their representative because I believe fundamentally that the workers should have a voice in their own future and their own destiny. So it was that understanding that I was elected to the board. It probably explains why I got fewer votes than anybody else. But in any case, I think as far as my learning from the board, and I hope I made a contribution, but I learned something about how money is allocated, which I thought was very, very useful. I quickly learned the desperate situation that confronted the Chrysler Corporation. I can tell you without going into the details, we're on the very, very brink of bankruptcy. I knew most of it as president of the union, but I learned more than I wanted to after I got on the board. But I think it was a good experience, and I think any labor leader can make a contribution to the board because they bring a different life experience and a different perspective to that board. I was the only one on that board that ever worked in an automobile plant. I was the only one on that board that had constant contact with the membership, so I could make a fairly accurate judgment of how they would react to a given situation. Now, I also learned, and this is a negative rather than positive, that there's some members of the board, outside directors, who are not sufficiently knowledgeable about the industry. Very bright people, hell, are chairman of the boards of their own company, and the inside board members, Iacocca and Greenwald and Bidwell and the rest of the group, have really too much information for them to challenge decisions. I was able to do it because I spent my whole life in the industry. And the other sad thing about the board, and there are more positive things than negative things, is in a couple of the debates, the one on the Toyota GM joint venture, after the debate was over and I was a lone dissenter, two board members come up to me and told me I was right in the debate, but did not raise their voices during the debate. And I don't know if this is I don't know if this goes on in other boards. It's just the personality of Iacocca where nobody would stand up to him. But I think on balance, it was a learning experience for me, and hopefully maybe I taught them a thing or two.
Isaac Regenstrife, City Club member. Would you care to comment on the rash of mergers, acquisitions, leveraged buyouts, and what impact you see that having on our economy and on the working men and women of America?
Well, first of all, I'm not against mergers per se. I'm opposed to mergers that just result in the shuffling of paper and a takeover that doesn't create any wealth to our nation, either in terms of jobs or technological advancement. And I think those are destructive. And maybe it's time that the government gave that matter some attention. Now, on the other hand, I think there's constructive mergers. I can think of mergers that took place that had they not taken place, the weaker company would have been bankrupt. I also think, this is maybe flies in the face of some of my liberal friends, but seriously, I think we should take a look at Sherman antitrust, not to make radical changes, but we should look as to whether or not some of the Sherman antitrust is not outdated and outmoded and obsolete. But generally speaking, it's discouraging and disturbing to me to see these mergers take place that really don't make a contribution to our society, but enriches some individuals. And I'll name one because I know him, which I think was absolutely disgraceful, and that is when I got a psychological block. Now I get the fellow who married Mary Cunningham, A.G. That was a disgraceful arrangement that he submitted the Bendix to, but that's the kind of mergers that I'm opposed to, and I question their validity, and maybe the government should turn some attention to that kind of merger.
Charlotte Kennedy, member. I wanted to change the subject a little bit and ask you about politics. There's been a traditional association between labor and the Democratic Party in most of our minds. How important to labor is the Democratic Party? And would you like to make some predictions about the way the presidential campaign will shape up and about the candidates that you'd like to see running?
Well, first of all, you know, the labor movement's not a monolith. There's room for vigorous dissent and debate, and we saw an example of Oregon 2 days ago, where the leadership and the committee recommended the endorsement of Weaver, and that point of view didn't prevail, although Weaver got the majority. It took a 2/3 vote. But you're going to see labor more intensely involved in politics. Let me just say quickly and go back to the '84 campaign. It's a lot of people's mind. Why did labor endorse Mondale in the primary? First time we've ever done it in history. And let me tell you about some of the debate that went on. Some of the people on the Executive Council, we are going to get involved in the primary process because in 1972 the Democratic Party gave us McGovern, they gave us Carter in 1976, they gave us Carter in 1980, and we don't want to just endorse anyone that the Democratic Convention hands to us. And so we're going to get involved early. There was another point of view, which was my point of view, is that you should make an endorsement in the primary process only when there's a philosophical difference between the candidates. In the days when this was subject to debate in Executive Council, AFL-CIO, John Glenn was the runner-up to Mondale, not Hart. Nobody even thought Hart had a chance, and I saw by their records and their philosophy a difference, and I voted to endorse Mondale in the primary. Now, people say, well, what abysmal failure. Well, you don't have to be a political genius to know, and I thought about this as I was voting, that if you endorse Mondale, he'd have some baggage, as they say in politics, to carry. You would be the captive of a special interest group. You would be a stooge for organized labor. But you weigh these disadvantages against advantages. All I can tell you, Hart and Glenn and all the people who criticize us for endorsing Mondale, I sat there and heard John Glenn come and ask for the endorsement, and Hart come and ask for an endorsement, and Cranston come and ask for an endorsement, and Fritz Hollings come and ask for an endorsement. They thought it was a hell of a good idea until Mondale got the endorsement. But the fact of the matter is that Mondale won the primary, and he couldn't have won it without the endorsement of organized labor. So labor still is a significant force in the Democratic Party. It depends upon the state that you're talking about. Alabama is a significant force, Wisconsin, Minnesota, New York, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and so forth. So it is a force. Now, in terms of 88, jot down the name of Joe Biden, and then you can tell people you heard it here first. But I think Joe Biden is an outside possibility. If you're asking me and you're not, but I'm going to give it to you anyway, my personal view, right now, and it's a long way from 88, I'd probably be more comfortable with Mario Cuomo than anyone else. But I think Hart obviously is a front runner now. I think some people are talking about Bradley. I think it would be better if Bradley ran perhaps for vice president because he's not that well known, although I think he's a fine senator. On the Republican side, George Bush, unquestionably, if the convention were held today, he would be the nominee. But George Bush, it seems to me, has some suicidal tendencies. He keeps doing himself. I don't know who George Bush is anymore. But I think you have to watch Kemp. There's a fellow that I served on a commission with in the U.S.-Japan Advisory Committee, and you're going to be hearing from him, Don Rumsfeld. Bob Dole and Baker, both outside chances. I don't think Robertson, the preacher, has a ghost of a chance. He's going to have considerable strength. He has considerable strength in Michigan, but he'll never get the nomination. And my reason for this is the American people will never select someone at the extreme, whether each they perceive as extreme, either the left or the right. And but in any event, the question is if Cuomo got the nomination, are the American people ready to elect a governor of New York State? And I think that's a consideration. He's a nice Catholic Italian boy. And
We've used up our time, and that's probably a pretty good note on which to end. So thank you very much, Mr. Fraser. We're delighted you could come.